Good evening. Welcome to the show. We have an interesting story to tell you tonight.
Let me take you back to January 16, 1920, the day the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution went into effect. This amendment officially banned alcohol, prohibiting its manufacture, sale, and transport. Then came the Volstead Act, which imposed up to 5 years in prison for alcohol trade. At first, many Americans felt relieved, since it put an end to the disaster that struck the country, alcoholism.
During the day, there wasn't a drop of alcohol in sight, but underground, there was a whole other world. Criminals became businessmen. Random drunken incidents turned into organized crime. Legal alcohol traders vanished, only to be replaced by the Mafia. And Americans would start asking, how did we ban one evil only to create a far greater one?
To understand why it was banned, we have to know the history of alcohol. Humans have known alcohol for thousands of years. In ancient Egypt, beer was a daily staple and part of workers' wages. In Viking beliefs, a warrior who died bravely was rewarded in the afterlife by having a drink with Odin in Valhalla.
When Europeans arrived to America, they discovered vast fertile lands. By the 17th century, agriculture thrived in America, especially corn, which once caused famines due to scarcity, now existed in abundance. In a great wide continent with a small population, they had a surplus, but transporting it was difficult and costly. So settlers had an idea. Why transport 20 sacks of corn when we can distill them into whiskey, store that in one barrel, transport it easily, and sell it for much more? 20 sacks of corn would take up so much storage space, not to mention the high risk of going bad. On the other hand, the longer they are stored as whiskey, the better, and the more expensive they get. Whiskey wasn't just the solution to storing corn, it became liquid gold.
But alcohol had changed greatly. Ancient Egyptian beer had only about 2% alcohol. Traditional fermentation could only go so far. At 12%, any further, the fermenting bacteria dies. But in the 18th century, Irish and Scottish immigrants in America brought along a game-changing invention called distillation, which is a chemical process that could push alcohol levels up to 50%.
Then came the Industrial Revolution, with machines that can accelerate that process, pushing alcohol levels up to 90%. Suddenly, they were able to produce whiskey cheaply and in large quantities. A bottle of whiskey was cheaper than a cup of coffee.
Doctors even encouraged drinking whiskey. Not alcoholics, doctors.
Wait, doctors actually told people to drink whiskey instead of coffee?
In the 18th century, clean water wasn't easily accessible in America. In many cities, people relied on stagnant water and small rivers contaminated with sewage. That's the perfect environment, a great house party for the spread of typhoid and cholera. So, American doctors convinced people to drink whiskey instead of contaminated water. Even children were given diluted whiskey to keep them from drinking water.
Whiskey became part of the Americans' everyday life. Sad? Have a drink. Happy? Have another. Drinking even became a worker's right. A worker's break was dictated by bell times. Bells rang twice a day. Work would stop and workers would go drink. By 1830, the average American with an average age of 15 was consuming 88 bottles of whiskey a year. That's 3 times the current rate. Americans were spending more on alcohol than the government. That's when the problem started, my friend. Bell time turned into the hour of terror. Workers would get drunk, go back to work, and accidents would happen. Drunk people lost limbs or died. Crime rates went up. In 1830, 80% of crimes in New York courts involved drunk defendants. 9 out of 10 prisoners had committed a crime after drinking whiskey. Half of all suicides were linked to drinking, and it even got worse. The Saturday night disaster. On Saturdays, workers got paid, went to the bar, spent half their weekly wages, then go home drunk and abuse their wives and children. That was before the world denounced domestic violence. Kids just hid when dad came home. A new kind of tragedy emerged. Saloon widows, women whose husbands practically lived in bars, drinking day and night. In cities like New York and Chicago, rat children spread. Those were kids who ran away from home to escape the fate of thousands before them.
who were killed or maimed during their drunken father's violent outbursts. Those kids often fell into addiction because many families gave kids beer instead of milk, as it was cheaper. At the time, it wasn't unusual to give a child diluted whiskey.
In short, alcohol was destroying society, and there had to be a counter-movement. In 1840, 6 alcoholics sat together in a saloon in Baltimore, admitting that alcohol had destroyed their lives. They pledged to quit drinking. They called themselves the Washingtonians. Their idea was simple: get alcoholics to admit their suffering, remind them they weren't alone, then pledge to never drink again. The idea spread rapidly. So much so that it had a representative in every state. Within a year, 500,000 men had taken the pledge. Around the same time, a woman named Eliza Thompson from Ohio emerged. Her son had died because of alcohol. She gathered 20 women, all dressed in black. After Sunday prayers, they stood in front of a pharmacy and began praying, begging the pharmacist not to sell alcohol prescriptions. The pharmacist was moved and did as they pleased.
They went on from one pharmacy to another, trying to convince pharmacists of the same thing. They called themselves the Women's Crusade. Gradually, women all over began to imitate them. They moved from churches into saloons, praying for the souls of drunk men. But like all new things, its shine grew dimmer after a while. Men started mocking them as they went by. Bartenders didn't let them in, poured water on them in the freezing cold if they stood outside the saloon. The movement quickly came to an end.
But in cities like Kansas, more aggressive movements began to emerge. A woman named Carrie Nation appeared. Her husband had died from alcohol poisoning. One day, she prayed, "God, rid this nation of alcohol." And she claimed she heard a voice, "Go to that saloon." So she did the next day. As she described it, she found herself bending down, grabbing a brick and smashing bottles of alcohol. Then she moved on to the next saloon. In a single night, my friend, she destroyed 3 saloons. The police arrested her, but after they released her, she bought a small hatchet and returned to smashing saloons. Gradually, hundreds of women joined her, moving from city to city, from one saloon to another, wrecking them. In just 1 month, they destroyed 100 saloons across 50 cities. Her image spread across all the saloons in Texas. Bar owners hired guards. Soon, all the saloons in the South hung the sign, "Everyone is welcome," except for Carrie Nation.
These individual efforts gradually came together, eventually forming the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a movement that brought together 250,000 women in a few months. These women sparked a major political movement under the slogan, "Do everything." In a society whose men struggle with alcoholism, women began demanding the right to vote so they could elect those who would ban alcohol.
All that just to shut down bars?
A saloon wasn't just a bar, my friend, but a core part of American society. This was a country in transition, with more immigrants pouring in and more factories everywhere. Next to each factory, dozens of saloons. By 1900, America had around 300,000 saloons. These saloons were extremely important, especially for new immigrants who wanted to socialize. After long working hours, the saloon was a place to unwind, a place to have fun, no responsibilities, an escape from household drama. New immigrants even learned English there and received their mails there, fully aware of the temperance movement. Saloon owners didn't just sit back, they got into politics. Then, half of New York City's council members were saloon owners, a council member by day and a saloon owner by night. Vote for me and have a glass of whiskey on the house. Some had bigger political ambitions. In Boston, Irish immigrant Patrick Kennedy used the profits from his saloons to get his family into politics. Those profits funded elite education for his children and grandchildren, and with that came the first Catholic president of Irish descent, John Kennedy. Another movement stepped in and turned everything around. They saw saloons as the enemy. The solution is to shut them down by law. They targeted politicians directly. They couldn't care less about the campaign or the promises. They had but one thing on mind. Will you ban alcohol? Say yes, and you get our votes. Say no, and we destroy you. Label you an enemy of the family, a promoter of sin, and give all our votes to your opponent. They were only about 10% of voters, but they were the deciding 10%. The leader of this movement was a lawyer called Wayne Wheeler,
who turned it into the most powerful lobbying force in American history. His name even became associated with the term Wheelerism, meaning to apply intense political pressure.
So, did that pressure work?
In 1905, the governor of Ohio, Myron Herrick, said he was against alcohol, but suggested each county decide for itself. Just for saying that, they launched one of the largest political campaigns in American history against him, and he lost the election. Despite having had the most supporters in the state, it sent a clear message to every politician. It doesn't matter how popular you are. If you oppose the Anti-Saloon League, you'll lose.
Controlling politics is one thing, business is another. The alcohol industry was massive. Immigration didn't just bring workers, it brought Germans, the kings of beer. One of the richest men in America, Adolphus Busch, supported pro-alcohol politicians and launched one of the biggest misleading ad campaigns in the US, claiming beer was healthy and that pregnant women who drank beer would have strong, intelligent babies.
By 1913, the Anti-Saloon League had succeeded in banning alcohol in 9 states. But that wasn't enough. Since traveling between states was easy, people would just go to another state to drink. The goal was a constitutional amendment that'd ban alcohol nationwide. But there was an issue. The U.S. produced 900 million barrels of alcohol yearly, and alcohol taxes made up 70% of federal revenue. So the movement made a brilliant move. They helped the federal government find an alternative source of revenue by supporting the 16th Amendment, which allowed the federal government to impose income taxes.
No alcohol? Take my income instead. The government agreed. Even then, alcohol was only prohibited in 16 out of 48 states. Nothing changed till 1917, when President Wilson declared war on Germany. America fought in World War I. Overnight, 2 million German Americans became possible enemies. At the top of that list, beer brewers.
The movement seized the moment. We have 2 German enemies. One across the ocean firing bullets at us, and one inside, destroying us with alcohol. Why give Germans our corn and wheat to make poison when we can use that to feed our soldiers? Under pressure, the Congress agreed with a 2/3 majority on the long-awaited resolution. On January 17, 1919, Nebraska ratified it, completing the required 2/3 majority, prohibiting the manufacture and sale of intoxicating liquor. And by January 16, 1920, the 5th largest industry in America was illegal.
It's important to know the difference between making a law and enforcing it. To enforce a law, you need 2 things. The first is public acceptance. The second is legal tools, proper funding and manpower to enforce the law, none of which existed at the time. Most Americans still saw alcohol as part of daily life, like cigarettes today. It's harmful, but I'm a grown man, and I'll do what I want. Even the U.S. President, Warren Harding, elected after Prohibition began, drank openly during meetings.
Where's my vodka? I have a meeting.
Some states voted against prohibiting alcohol, like Washington. Washington's governor refused to fund the enforcement of that law. He wouldn't even pay to print posters. New Jersey's governor went even further, promising to keep alcohol flowing, saying there'll be as much alcohol as there is water in the Atlantic.
As for tools, banning something requires a specialized force. But who funds an anti-alcohol force? The federal government said it was the state's responsibility. States said it was the federal government's responsibility. The result? A weak enforcement bureau with only 1,500 officers, many untrained, plenty hired through connections. It became one of the most corrupt police forces in American history. And the Volstead Act itself was full of loopholes. For example, pharmacies were allowed to sell alcohol for medical purposes. That loophole alone resulted in 6 million alcohol prescriptions during Prohibition. Doctors took bribes to write those prescriptions. The law also stated that existing alcohol stocks wouldn't be destroyed, but owners had to dispose of them legally through pharmacies. So a lawyer in Chicago named George Remus pulled off one of the biggest scams in American history. He bought the entire stock of struggling distilleries and at the same time bought a chain of pharmacies. Then he sold alcohol from his distilleries to his pharmacies, but the shipment
never really made it to the pharmacies. The trucks transporting the alcohol were always robbed by his own men, who redirected the alcohol to a secret warehouse. From there, it was sold on the black market at astronomical prices. And that's just the legal loopholes. Geography made things even worse. The US shares an 8,000-kilometer border with Canada. The distance between Vancouver and Seattle is just 200 kilometers. A former Seattle police officer called Roy Olmsted had ships load alcohol in Vancouver, wait at a remote island between the two countries called Darcy Island, and during snowstorms, dozens of boats loaded with thousands of bottles would slip into Seattle, especially since Washington's governor basically didn't care.
But that was nothing compared to the smuggling empire built along the East Coast, known as Rum Row. Ships from England and the Bahamas would stop just beyond U.S. territorial waters, which at the time extended only 3 miles from shore. That's why these ships anchored 3.1 miles away in international waters just outside reach, so the Coast Guard couldn't legally touch them. Ships made a large queue. At night, faster boats, faster than Coast Guard vessels, would head out from New York, New Jersey, and Boston, buy crates, and race back to shore to unload them.
The number of ships lined up on Rum Row was so massive that from afar at night, their lights looked like city lights. Now, the people running this business weren't exactly your typical businessmen. They were criminals, used to breaking the law. That business had criminals of all kinds. Thieves and street thugs suddenly found themselves in an extraordinary situation. A case of whiskey sold for $5 in Canada could be sold for $80 in the US. Overnight, crooks became insanely rich.
Prohibition formed what became known as goons, roughly translated to gangs. They ran the underground world of alcohol. Over time, they grew into massive criminal groups with loads of money. And this is when the feared organized crime was born, the Mafia. The annual profit of Al Capone's gang in Chicago reached $60 million, equivalent to about $1 billion today. Al Capone became a superstar, even more famous than the president. Despite running a billion-dollar criminal empire, he described himself as just a man trying to give the American people a good time. But gangs don't just give people a good time. They fight over territory. And when gangs making millions fight, those fights turn into real wars. In the 20s, dozens of gang wars killed hundreds of Americans. Innocent citizens who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. This escalated, especially with the rise of drive-by shootings. Gangs firing from moving cars. This coincided with the mass production of automobiles, like Ford cars, which were faster than police vehicles. And when you're making that kind of money, you can invest in infrastructure. Bloody wars without accountability because witnesses were too afraid to speak. By 1926, crime rates in the US rose by 24%, murders increased by 12%, theft by 9%, and assaults by 13%.
So where's the government? Didn't we ban alcohol? What's going on?
Gangs had so much money at their disposal, there was nothing they couldn't buy. In the 1927 Chicago mayoral election, Al Capone spent $250,000 to back one of the most corrupt mayors in U.S. history, Bill Thompson. It wasn't just bribes. Al Capone was also responsible for the Pineapple Primary, where his men intimidated voters in areas that opposed Thompson and threw hand grenades at them. Absolute terror. According to the Assistant Attorney General, 60% of Chicago police officers were members of smuggling gangs, a fox guarding the henhouse. When George Remus was arrested, it was revealed he had been bribing Attorney General Harry Doherty, paying him 50 cents for every case of smuggled whiskey, plus $240,000 to never go to jail, even if caught. Roy Olmsted, the Seattle smuggler, openly bragged that there wasn't a single officer or government official whom he hadn't paid off. As the cost of smuggling increased, the price of smuggled alcohol went up. That's when cheaper, low-quality types started to appear, known as Bathtub Gin. Let me explain. People would take alcohol of 90% concentration, used for cleaning purposes, mix it in a bathtub with juice, and sell it cheaply as alcohol. But that type of alcohol wasn't always available. So many started mixing it with other substances. In 1926, in New York City alone, 1,200 people died of poison from bathtub gin. On New Year's Eve that same year, 400 people died from tainted liquor, not to mention the tens of thousands who lost their sight. By 1930, around 50,000 Americans suffered from a strange paralysis called Jake leg, caused by drinking a liquor called Jake that had an adulterant used in paint. People started making alcohol at home using simple equipment and ingredients you could buy from grocery stores, like concentrated grape juice. Once word got out, the price of grapes skyrocketed from $9 to $375 per ton. Grapes were still a legal commodity, of course, but the demand increased suddenly. The reason? Who knows? Even major alcohol producers shifted to making yeast, labeling it with warnings like, "Do not mix with sugar and warm water and leave in a dark place. Otherwise, it'll cause fermentation and produce alcohol," which is illegal. That wasn't really a warning. It was a recipe.
But what happened in Chicago and New York was on another level. Secret saloons took place in basements. They were called speakeasies. They were called that because they had to keep it down. They had membership systems and passwords. Doors had small peepholes to see who was coming in. New York alone had around 23,000 speakeasies.
Some bars had mechanical systems to hide it all if the police showed up. With a click of a button, the entire bar disappeared. It's just a perfume shop. Would you like a fragrance? Clubs like Club 21 became famous as they'd survived police raids without getting caught. When the police came, the band would start playing the national anthem. We're just gathered here out of love for the country. This made many Americans feel like drinking was an act of rebellion. Men didn't just drink, they drank to defy the law. An adrenaline dose. Women also started going to speakeasies. They were known as flappers. They cut their hair short, drank, and smoked as a form of social rebellion. There was also binge drinking. People drank excessively. Alcohol was smuggled, so it wasn't always available. Whenever people found a bottle, they chugged it all, since they didn't know when they'll have another. Speakeasies weren't just for drinking anymore. Many became hubs for prostitution and gambling. Chicago alone had about 20,000 slot machines. Al Capone alone owned around 160 brothels, and the gangs forced women into it. Al Capone was pure evil. As the Prohibition system collapsed, courts didn't have enough time or money for trials. New York had 50,000 Prohibition violations annually. Courts were filled with hundreds of defendants at once. Judges asked for a show of hands for those willing to pay a small fine for a milder sentence. Seeing this, police officers were tempted to take the money that would otherwise go as fines to the government. The system fell deeper into corruption. I arrested you. Either pay me now or go to court, pay a fine, or worse. It couldn't get any worse. Murder, prostitution, drinking, bribery. What's left? Sectarian conflict. Bingo. By 1928, Prohibition turned into a religious battle between Protestant Americans who established strict churches, which were actually the cornerstone for the Prohibition, and Catholic immigrants who came in the early 20th century from Italy, Ireland, and Germany. They weren't as reserved about alcohol. They hated the Prohibition.
That tension reached its peak when Al Smith became the first Catholic presidential candidate and openly called the Prohibition a stupid law that should be repealed. That was the first of the religious battle. Protestant churches launched a massive campaign alongside the Ku Klux Klan and the Anti-Saloon League. This campaign labeled Al Smith as destroyer of the family and spread rumors claiming that if he won, he'd take orders from the Pope and turn the White House into the Vatican. Al Smith lost to the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover, by a massive margin of 6 million votes, a crushing blow, not just politically, but symbolically for American Catholics.
Our story began with an unexpected event, and it would end one too. A woman named Pauline Sabin, a wealthy Republican Protestant aristocrat and supporter of the Prohibition, attended an official celebration for Hoover's victory, who also supported the Prohibition. She noticed that the same politicians celebrating were drinking alcohol. That moment made her reflect on the absurdity of the situation. Prohibition had transformed Americans from alcoholics into hypocrites.
She later said she had supported the Prohibition for the sake of her kids. But what happened was the opposite. It made the forbidden more desirable. People still drank, but in secret, under the control of gangs. A law that people don't respect
only creates stronger, more dangerous criminals. No one in the Republican Party paid her attention. She resigned and founded the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform.
Pauline came from the Republican National Committee, so she was experienced in political campaigns and wealthy. But most importantly, she was a woman. And just as women had played a major role in enforcing prohibition, they led the movement to dismantle it. Hundreds of thousands supported her with the same aim, protecting the American family. But this time, from gangs that sell the alcohol. They had to protect their families from social and political hypocrisy.
Then came February 14, 1929.
Chicago PD officers raided a warehouse that belonged to Bugs Moran, Al Capone's main rival. 7 gang members came out, hands raised, but the officers lined them up against the wall and then opened fire, murdered in cold blood. Afterward, the officers fled because they weren't real officers. They were Al Capone's men. The photos of the massacre shocked many Americans. Many began to see Pauline was right. A law meant to prevent evil had created something far worse.
Then came October 24th, 1929. The stock market crashed, and, well, you know what happened next. The Great Depression. 9 million Americans lost their life savings. 15 million lost their jobs. Hundreds of thousands couldn't even afford food. Government tax revenues collapsed because there no longer was an income to tax. Alcohol taxes could have helped, but that money was going to gangs. Al Capone was a live example of the irony. During the economic collapse, Al Capone was a real-life Robin Hood. He opened free soup kitchens for the poor. Instead of focusing on the economic disaster, the government had used up its resources trying to control people's morals through a law that millions of Americans never really accepted.
At that point, Americans began blaming President Hoover until a Democratic candidate appeared, Franklin D. Roosevelt. He ran on the slogan, New Deal, a new economy, new industries. He said he'd do the opposite of what Hoover had done. And one of the first things he promised? To end the Prohibition and revive the 5th largest industry in America, alcohol.
Roosevelt promised Americans 2 things. He would cure their hunger and their thirst. Bread and beer. After winning, he moved quickly. He created jobs for 3 million young men, reformed banking laws, and allowed the sale of beer. On April 7th, 1933, millions of Americans took to the streets to do what? To legally buy beer. Soon after, Congress passed the 21st Amendment of the Constitution, repealing the 18th Amendment. It remains the only amendment ever to be repealed.
Since then, the U.S. has tried to control alcohol through regulations, taxes, age limits, DUI laws. Maybe the only thing that actually reduced alcohol consumption was the legalization of marijuana. Americans' consumption of alcohol decreased over time by 1/3, but the problem persists. 15 million Americans suffer from alcoholism. Drinking and driving kills 1 person every 39 minutes. Statistics suggest that alcohol addiction costs the economy around $249 billion annually. 178,000 deaths per year are linked to alcohol.
And so the debate continues. How do you prevent harm without causing greater harm? When does the government have the right to say, don't drink alcohol? And when should it step back and simply advise you? There's still no clear answer. Last but not least, don't forget to watch the old episodes and the new ones. Check the sources below and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Someone once asked an alcoholic, what's your favorite quote? He said, to beer or not to beer? All right, that's it. Cheers.